Excellent. Releasing in Australian cinemas in May is a new documentary about social housing, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Lucie McMahon, who is the writer-director of Things Will Be Different. Lucie, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thanks so much for having me.
Congratulations on making this documentary, which exposes so much about social housing and the impact that it has on two people in particular in this film. How did it all come about?
So I grew up in public housing in Collingwood. And so I think I was just reading the news one day and I saw the news about the state government's announcement about the public housing renewal program, which was the first phase of renewal that swept about around 6 estates in inner city Melbourne, Walker Street being one of them. And so I joined a local grassroots advocacy and activism group called the Safe Public Housing Collective. And just to sort of, I guess, get involved and learn more about what was happening and put a little bit of, energy into, I guess, trying to see if there's anything that could be done to prevent the destruction of public housing. And there I met Celeste Declario, who is the cinematographer and one of the producers on the film. She had been a resident of Walker Street, so she'd lived there for different periods. And yeah, she introduced me to Will and Najat, who are the two families in the film, who at this stage had sort of accepted that Walker Street was going to be demolished and they were going to be moved on. Like they'd been kind of campaigning and fighting to see if they could prevent the demolition for years at the point that I met them. So at the point that I met them and that we began filming, they'd sort of accepted that it was going to happen, and it was more a process of, okay, well, how do we make sure that we both don't get too dislocated from our communities in the process of moving on to new public housing homes.
Okay, and we should mention Walker Street is in Northcote, which is
Mhm.
in Victoria.
Yes.
So because there's
Yes.
this interview will be on YouTube, so nationally people will be looking at it. Okay, excellent. So tell me about the actual logistics of making the film, because I gather
Yeah.
is this your first film?
Yeah, it's my first feature. I had written and directed a couple of narrative shorts at uni, and I've also produced other films, but it was my first film kind of as a director producer. And yeah, it came about in a fairly unusual way. As I mentioned, I met Celeste through the collective. Celeste was quite keen to kind of document what was going on, as were the participants, Will and Najat. And so we sort of just started the project off, even, I guess, more like an archival project where we were like, this feels like an important moment to document. We didn't necessarily have a clear sight being like, this will turn into a feature documentary. We just sort of, Celeste was a photography student, so she had access to cameras. And so we just sort of started rolling on the experience of like me meeting Najat and Will and talking to them about what was going on. Um, we, through the Save Public Housing Collective, we're working with researchers from RMIT's Global and Urban Studies, David Kelly and Libby Porter. And they both spent a lot of time researching and working in public housing and doing research about the impacts of forced displacement and the potential negative impacts that the renewal program was going to have on people living in public housing, but also just on the housing crisis more broadly. And I guess they were quite encouraging to Celeste and I that perhaps a film could be a really useful political tool in a moment like this, where, you know, they're writing a lot of academic papers, but maybe academic papers don't have as broad a reach as if you make a film and are able to show kind of like the minute details of the everyday experience of people who are going through this process of, forced relocation.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating documentation because I was so intrigued about where these two people were going to relocate. How
Mm.
how willing were Will and Najat to talk to camera and to really say whatever they wanted?
Yeah, I mean, I think Celeste's relationship to both of them really helped. They they both were sort of, I think they were as equally keen to have the process documented. Like they just come off the back of a lot of campaigning trying to prevent the relocation. And I guess they'd accepted that that wasn't going to happen. And so now they were like, well, can we at least show, what this process involves and, get a little bit of exposure. So they were both, yeah, really keen on the film happening. And yeah, the fact that Celeste had lived next door to Najat and had this relationship with Will, where Will had dated her mother, it meant that they were very comfortable from sort of day one. And a lot of that, Celeste kind of was that bridge, I guess, in terms of, they trusted her, yeah, from the beginning.
Okay, excellent. I was so intrigued, especially about Najat and her children, and finding other public housing that would be suitable. I was getting
Mm.
really really concerned that it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think, one of the things that the film touches on in quite a subtle way, it doesn't really flesh it out a lot, is that one of the key problems with these renewal processes is that there's actually a shortage of public housing and housing generally in Victoria. And so when you're trying to relocate people, there's actually not a lot of options available to them, particularly if they're trying to stay connected to their children's schools or doctor's services, or inner city areas don't have a lot of public housing. And so actually both Will and Najat have been moved into properties that I would say are not super suitable and have brought up a lot of issues for both of them, sort of down the track. And yeah, I think it's just indicative of some of the flaws to do with, yeah, this program and this process at large.
I mean, you really do throw up the whole issue of public housing, the lack of it, and the importance of it, and people connecting to
Mm,
community and so on. There are
yeah.
a number of issues that you do traverse in the film.
Mm.
Yeah, so well done on that. Were you at all tempted to get a bit political and have some commentators or politicians or whatever to comment on the public housing issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess Celeste and I spoke early on about how um I guess uh there's already like quite a lot of political content that exists around the issue of public housing. Like there's a lot of really outspoken Greens ministers like Gabrielle de Vitry and Samantha Ratton, who, create a lot of social media content. There's a lot of discourse in the news about it. And I think Celeste and I from the outset sort of thought, how can we make a film that perhaps is less didactic and is less informative? Like the film really isn't giving you an expansive overview of all of the statistics to do with public housing. We really, yeah, wanted it to be sort of more of an intimate and emotional experience for audiences that might encourage them to, connect on an empathetic level with the subjects and the participants, and then that maybe to trigger further engagement. So I guess it was, yeah, a conscious choice from the outset to make something that was a little bit more personal and intimate, rather than something that was super informative. And I mean, the film is political, but it's not political in a sort of journalistic sense, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it's more subtle than that. That's right. I,
Mm.
I, I like that. Were there any influences on the way that you made the film? Because I was thinking back to a lot of the social housing and other films that were made in Victoria and New South Wales in the 50s and 60s in particular, exposing all sorts of social issues. I'm
Mm.
just wondering if you were influenced at all by anything.
I hadn't seen any documentaries from the 50s or 60s exposing issues to do with public housing. I did see there was one called the Pruitt-Igoe myth, which was set in the UK, which sort of looked at some of the issues to do with public housing there. We did watch a lot of archival stuff that some of it ended up featuring in the film, which was more around from the period of like around the 40s. And the archival stuff that we were looking at was more kind of talking about the Slum Reclamation Act and the period of bad living conditions that people were subject to before public housing was built, and then talking about public housing as being this really sort of exciting thing that the government was investing in. So we watched a lot of like footage and videos that had been made from like the Department of Housing in the 1940s, sort of talking about the importance of public housing, which was really interesting. And I've spoken about this in other interviews as well, but I just think just like the kind of the cyclical nature of history and kind of, yeah, looking back at that time and, you know, government saying people are living in really bad housing conditions. In order to address this, we have to invest in public housing. They do that. It addresses the housing crisis for quite a long period. And then I guess over the last, 15 years or so, we've seen this divestment in public housing. And now we have quite severe housing crisis and housing issues emerging again. And it does feel like we kind of are going through this cycle where the conditions of renters and the conditions that people have access to in terms of housing are quite bad at the moment. And hopefully we'll come out of this with an investment from government to build more public housing. But yeah, it was interesting watching that stuff and just sort of thinking about the cyclical nature of history. And then I guess outside of that, um, there's an amazing film by Mark Singer called Dark Days, which is a documentary about homeless people living in the New York underground. And yeah, again, it's like a very intimate film. It's also his first time making a film. He shoots it all on 16 mil. But yeah, I think there was just, there was probably a series of kind of arty documentaries like that, like the work of Ben Rivers, sort of slower, more meditative, observational films that have where it's clear that the filmmaker has quite a close connection with the participants. There was those sorts of films that we watched in the early stages and sort of thought like, yeah, this is an interesting approach to take when making a film about a social issue, and they influenced us quite a bit.
Okay, that all sounds really interesting, and some great research there that you've done and so on. Obviously, you shot this over a period of time, and you would have had a lot of footage. Tell me about the editing process, because that's never easy, even though it's a 65-minute
No.
documentary. But how did all
Yeah,
that
we
work?
had we worked with an amazing editor, Zach Milner-Cretney, who patiently and I think very painstakingly uh gave us an assembly of footage that when I watched it before we began the edit process, I had absolutely no idea how a film was going to emerge from the footage that we gave him. As I said earlier, the project came about in a very unconventional way. And Celeste had never filmed a film before. She had a background in photography. And, some of the first shoots that we did, which end up in the film, are things that she shot on DSLR camera without a tripod, without any microphone attached. And so, there's this sort of there's this lo-fi quality to some of the footage, which I think is part of the film's charm, but it definitely meant, it meant that Zach had his work cut out for him in the edit, because in those early shoots, because we weren't thinking necessarily about making a documentary, we weren't thinking about things like coverage and B-roll and um, establishing shots and things like this. I think one of the beautiful things about watching the film for me now is seeing the way that Celeste's cinematography kind of evolves as the film goes on. And I always knew that she had an eye for framing people and framing people's faces, but you really see the progression of her work as a cinematographer throughout the film. But yeah, in terms of the edit, it was a long process. And yeah, we worked with Zach, and he, sort of painstakingly and patiently did an assembly for us. And then because we sort of, I guess we had little bits of money, we didn't have development funding or production funding for this project. We got completion funding from Screen Australia. But because we just had little bits of money coming in through council grants, different people worked on the edit at different points. So Zach did the bulk of that really important sort of first assembly. And then I worked with a friend, Eliza Hines, who had been working at Wild Bear as an editor. And she came in and sort of did some of the later kind of fine cut editing process. But it was, a pretty unusual editing process as well, I would say, in the sense that it sort of got passed along from Zach to Eliza and then would go back to Zach sometimes. And I even would have a go at cutting scenes from time to time. So we kind of all, I would say we worked together quite collaboratively on the edit.
Okay, well done on that, because it's never an easy process. So well done. I'm intrigued to know how Will and Najat reacted to the film when they saw it.
Yeah. So we had a little screening with them at Composite, which is a screening venue inside Collingwood Yards here in Melbourne, where we showed the film to Will and Najat and the kids, and a friend of ours, Libby Porter, who also worked as an EP on the film. Um, yeah, I mean, I think mixed reactions. Like, I think it's a really personal and like difficult time that the film documents. And I think, there's moments in the film that are really funny, that it's sort of nice that have been captured. And then I think there's other moments in the film that are, were really difficult times in both of their lives. And so I think, I think it was, yeah, somewhat mixed reactions, but ultimately, yeah, they're both really happy that the film is, you know, out in the world, and hopefully going to contribute some small, yeah, piece of, I guess, information in the broader social debate that's going on at the moment.
Exactly. I think that's very important. And how are they both? Are they sort of settling into their new environments?
I guess without going into too much detail about their personal lives, I would just say that, yeah, it's not ended. Neither of them, the properties that they were moved into were very suitable. Like I would say that they were
Mm.
vacant because people had moved out of them because there were major issues, like either structural issues with like big cracks that have emerged in the walls or issues with neighbors. So yeah, I think it's just, yeah, it's been difficult for both of them in different ways over the last couple of years since they moved out of Walker Street. Yeah, yeah, it's I think, you know, those properties were vacant for a reason, I would say. Yeah.
Sure, sure. No, I understand. Okay. Now, the film is releasing in various cinemas with special screenings across Australia. Tell me about that rollout and more details, because there's also a
Yeah.
website, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah. So the film will premiere at Setting Sun Film Festival, which is happening in Footscray, and I believe that screening is on Sunday, the 12th of May. And then we're doing a sort of national rollout with a small theatrical release. So there's 3 screenings in Melbourne, one in Perth, a couple in New South Wales, one in Sydney, one in Byron, and one in Lismore, and then one in Brisbane as well. And all of the screenings are kind of accompanied by panels with local grassroots housing groups. So really the idea of the screenings was to yeah, kind of get in touch with local groups and chat to them about ways that the film might be able to be a useful tool in terms of the stuff that they're doing locally. So yeah, you can check out all the information about those screenings on our website, which is thingswillbedifferent.com, or you can follow us on Instagram as well. If you just search Things Will Be Different, it comes up, and we're keeping that page up to date with information about all of the screenings.
Okay, excellent. How did you decide on the title?
So the title is the title of a song and an album by a local mod band from Melbourne from the 80s called Things Will Be Different. So the band is called Little Murders, and they've got an album and a song called Things Will Be Different. And we were sort of, yeah, we were brainstorming for titles. We had the idea that, you know, maybe a song name could be a good idea for a title. And Will is really into music. He's like a massive record collector. And yeah, we listened as we were making the film, we listened to a lot of post-punk music as when we were after shoots, or and so yeah, Will was sort of just sending, you know, ideas for the title based on the song names, and he sent Things Will Be Different. And it felt, I guess, just fitting in terms of like, you know, the sentiment of the film. And the film really is this I think sort of we started out wanting to document this moment because we were like, well, this is a really significant moment in history in terms of government, you know, wanting to wipe its hands clean of the responsibility of housing vulnerable people in our society. And I guess, yeah, the idea that things will be different. We don't know what they'll be like. They may be worse. They're likely going to be worse, but they're going to be different after this point. Like if government does continue to sell off public housing in Victoria and Australia.
Yes. Oh, you certainly raised those issues really well in this documentary. I was just also wondering, did you at all consider having a narrator or having something a bit more in terms of telling or giving audiences more information, or did you want it to be, which I think works effectively, more the fly on the wall observational sort of type?
Yeah, I think, you know, I do have a tendency to like observational films, and it's not surprising that that sort of has come up in the way that I've approached making this film. I think there's, yeah, something interesting about showing rather than telling, and letting audiences kind of, you know, treating your audience as intelligent and letting them kind of connect the dots and put pieces together. Like they're the
Mm.
sorts of films that I like, the films that invite you to kind of, yeah, look closely and draw your own conclusions rather than films that tell you what to think, even though observational films are often encouraging you to think in a particular way, and they're still definitely, you know, putting forward a message, they just leave a little bit more room for contemplation.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah, it's not surprising that that sort of has emerged. I guess there's like a bit of a balance though, like there definitely was, I was like, that's my sort of artistic taste, but then this film also does have to serve some sort of a social function, which is, to make sure that we are not creating further stigma towards people that live in public housing, and to make clear the sort of at least the basic facts around the renewal process. So there's moments where Will does do voiceover in the film, and I think those moments are sort of like punctuated. I think it's at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and I felt like those moments were just a good compromise in terms of wanting to leave the film a little bit more ambiguous and let audiences have some time to contemplate for themselves, but also communicating clearly what it is that we feel that the film needs to say, and what it is that we feel we need to say in relation to these issues that the film is looking at. So yeah, I think Will's voiceover, it might not have been necessarily the way that I would make a film if it wasn't looking at these social issues, but I think it strikes a good sort of balance between, something a little bit more expository and something a bit more observational.
Fair enough. You always have to make these artistic decisions, and I think that fits the film very well. So that's great. Two quick questions to round off the interview, Lucy. What got you into filmmaking in the first place?
Great question. I started out in production design. So when I was 18 and left high school, I went to VCA and studied production design. And then I was always interested in film. Like in high school, I did media studies and made some short films. But yeah, decided to pursue production design, and then ended up meeting a lot of filmmakers through my final year placement. I worked with Elena Lodkina and Amiel Corton-Wilson and Tom Wright. So I guess just quite luckily fell in with like some very interesting filmmakers in my final year of study. And then I went back and I did a postgrad in screen and cultural studies. And as part of that postgrad, I did an exchange to Columbia Uni in New York. And I took a subject which was called beginning video. And there was this really amazing like artist filmmaker, Cecilia Doherty, who taught that class. And yeah, I think it was like my first time thinking about ways that you can make film, I guess more like art films. Like film doesn't, like I think I'd often thought about film as, particularly coming from a background in production design, as being these massive sets. Like I'd worked on Neighbours and I'd worked on Tomorrow When the War Began. And I didn't feel as interested in working on those kinds of films or making those kinds of films. And I did this class with Cecilia, and I made a couple of, experimental short films. And yeah, I feel like it was really kind of learning from her and being taught by her and thinking about more intimate ways of filmmaking and more sort of small scale ways of filmmaking that really drew me into that process. Yeah.
How interesting to hear that your background, how superb that is. And just finally, are you working on another film at the moment?
I am, yeah. So me and my partner, Emmett Aldred, who was one of the associate producers on Things Will Be Different, him and I are in the early stages of research, making a documentary about local queer history. Um, I, I'm not sure how much I should give away about the project, but it'll be directed by him. I'm going to produce it, which I'm very excited about, taking a step back from directing. And it's going to look at the history of like the local hormone trades that went on between trans and gender diverse people in Melbourne before you could legally or easily access hormone replacement therapy. So that's in the pipeline. It'll probably be 4 or 5 years before it's out in the world, but we're in the very early stages of that at the moment.
I do understand it takes a while to get a film going, so but I wish you well with that. Look, congratulations. We've been speaking to Lucie McMahon, who's the writer-director of the documentary Things Will Be Different, releasing in various cinemas across Australia in May. Lucie, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. All the best. Bye-bye.
See ya.